The cold was the first thing you noticed, and it had teeth. It wasn't the honest, biting cold of a Geneva winter night whipping off the lake. A cold that numbed your cheeks and made your eyes water until the world blurred into a watercolor of street lights. This was a different beast entirely, a predator of a cold. It was a manufactured, sterile chill that had nothing to do with nature and everything to do with the preservation of secrets. It seeped through the advanced polymer layers of his Cry Precision G3 combat gear. A silent, insidious invasion that bypassed the thermal insulation to settle deep in his bones, making his joints ache with a phantom arthritis. It was the absolute zero of humming server racks. A cold that smelled of ozone, clean, high-voltage electricity, and the faint, acrid tang of burnt tungsten from their entry. Alec Thorne breathed it in, the scent a familiar, almost comforting perfume of his trade. He remained perfectly still, a predator frozen in the final, patient moment before the strike. His body a study in controlled potential energy. His gloved hand, covered in thin, fire-retardant Nomex, hovered inches from a blinking server module. Its rhythmic green pulse, precisely 1 beat per second, was a tiny, mechanical heartbeat in the refrigerated gloom, a metronome counting down the seconds of their intrusion. Behind him, resting on the polished, anti-static concrete floor, lay the tool of their entry, looking like a prop from a science fiction film. It was a Kalis 7 thermic lance, a masterpiece of controlled destruction from a boutique German engineering firm that didn't officially exist. Its nozzle, a ring of exotic ceramic composite designed to withstand temperatures that could melt tungsten, still pulsed with a dull, malevolent cherry-red heat, a fading ember from the miniature sun it had created to slice through the vault's 3-inch tungsten carbide door. The circular slab of metal it had excised lay beside it like a massive, impossibly heavy steel coin, the edges still shimmering with latent heat. "Status, Ben," Alec whispered, his voice a low rumble that was immediately swallowed by the omnipresent, multi-layered drone of the cooling fans. The sound wasn't just a hum. It was a complex symphony of whirring blades, a carefully engineered orchestra of thermodynamics. There was the deep baritone of the primary heat exchangers mounted on the far wall, the steady alto of the rack-level fans pushing air through the server blades, and the high-pitched mosquito whine of individual processor fans, each one spinning at thousands of RPM. His breath plumed in the refrigerated air, a fleeting, organic ghost in a world of pure machine. Across the small, cramped room, no larger than a walk-in closet, Ben Carter was a hunched silhouette, his face illuminated by the ghostly blue-white light of his ruggedized Panasonic Toughbook CF33. He looked like a cybernetic monk at prayer, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. A thin, flickering umbilical of fiber-optic cable snaked from its shielded port to the server's primary interface, a digital parasite sucking the lifeblood from its host. "Working," Ben breathed back, his voice tight and strained, the whisper cracking with tension. He never took his eyes off the cascading lines of hexadecimal code and nested progress bars scrolling across his screen. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing clean paths through the grime he'd picked up crawling through a century's worth of forgotten service ducts beneath the city. His fingers danced across the backlit keyboard, a frantic, desperate ballet of keystrokes. Barakat's architecture is beautiful, in a sociopathic, labyrinthine sort of way. It's not a file system, Al. It's a living organism, a data hydra. Every file is braided into the next, encrypted with a different key that's algorithmically generated from the file before it. It's a goddamn Celtic knot of data, seeded with quantum randomized variables, You can't just snip one piece out. You have to unravel the whole thing at once. It's designed to be all or nothing. Alec didn't need the technical breakdown. He trusted Ben's genius implicitly. He just needed the result. He scanned the room again, his eyes, long accustomed to operating in low light, picking out every detail with practiced efficiency. The single reinforced door they'd entered through, its locking mechanism now bypassed and inert, a deadbolt temporarily hypnotized by Ben's signal repeater. The ceiling-mounted passive infrared motion sensor, currently blinded by a precisely aimed burst of cryo-cooled nitrogen from a canister no bigger than a can of shaving cream, which had frozen its delicate germanium lens. The two Bosch FlexiDome CCTV cameras, one in each corner, their feeds now showing a looped 30-second recording of an empty room. A digital ghost story playing for an audience of no one. Everything was perfect. Every contingency planned for, every variable controlled. It was the quiet, surgical precision of the job that he loved. The clean, cold logic of it all. And then, with a sound that was anything but logical, the entire equation of their mission shattered. The sound wasn't a klaxon. That was the first thing that was so profoundly wrong. It wasn't the shrieking, building-shaking alarm you see in films, the kind that sends pigeons scattering from rooftops for a 3-block radius and brings screaming police cars from every direction. This was something far more insidious, far more terrifying. It was a low, resonant chime, almost polite, that pulsed through the concrete floor and up through the thick Vibram soles of Alec's Loa combat boots. It wasn't loud, but it had weight. A physical presence in the room that seemed to compress the air. It was the sound of a very expensive, very discreet, and very serious system telling a handful of very serious people that something, somewhere, was not as it should be. And he and Ben Carter were that something. Alec froze, his muscles tensing into knots of steel, every nerve ending screaming a silent alarm of its own. The complex drone of the server fans seemed to deepen, the white noise growing a menacing, predatory edge. The comfortable, professional chill of the room suddenly felt like the absolute cold of a tomb. "Ben," he breathed, his voice a dry rasp in the sudden, suffocating silence that fell between the chimes. "I hear it," Ben whispered, his frantic typing becoming even more frenzied. The clicks of the keys like the frantic chattering of teeth. "Damn it, I hear it. It's not local, not from this room. It's a network alert, a passive tripwire on the main comms line. Someone just tried to remotely ping the system from outside the embassy network." Alec's mind raced, processing the information with the cold, detached clarity that had kept him alive for 15 years in the service of His Majesty's government. A remote ping. That was impossible. Control had assured them the building's external communications were on a ghost loop. A sophisticated piece of electronic mimicry feeding the Syrian monitoring station in Damascus, a pre-recorded, endlessly repeating stream of benign data traffic. It was the digital equivalent of a security guard, watching a video of an empty corridor while you walk right behind him. For someone to bypass that loop and ping this specific, air-gapped server directly meant their countermeasures had not just failed, they had been surgically and deliberately dismantled. "How long?" Alec demanded, his gaze snapping to the reinforced door. As if on cue, his question was answered by a series of soft, definitive clicks from within its mechanism. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The magnetic locks, heavy-duty electromagnets, which they had painstakingly bypassed with a signal jammer and a bypass key, were re-engaging, one by one. They were sealed in. "The download is at 78%, Ben said, his voice tight with strain, cracking on the last word. "The Damascus list. Al, it's all here. Encrypted to hell and back. but it's the whole bloody directory. Names, locations, handlers, and payout schedules for every asset east of Cyprus. He didn't need to elaborate on the stakes. That list was the holy grail of Middle Eastern intelligence, the crown jewels of the Syrian Mukhabarat. If it fell into the wrong hands, or worse, was simply wiped by a panicked Colonel Barakat hitting a kill switch, decades of painstaking work, countless lives, would be rendered meaningless. Men and women on the ground, deep undercover in places like Homs, Aleppo, and Beirut, would be ghosts, their names and faces suddenly appearing on execution lists from Tehran to Tripoli. 78% isn't 100%, Alex said, his movements economical and swift. He drew his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P229 Legion, from the Kydex holster strapped to his chest rig. The matte gray Cerakote finish absorbed the dim light, giving the weapon a spectral appearance. The weight of it in his hand was a familiar, solid comfort. The Obsidian 9 suppressor was already attached, a pointless gesture inside a sealed vault. More of a psychological comfort blanket than a practical tool at this point. But protocol was protocol. In his line of work, muscle memory was a powerful religion. Forget the full download. Can you get a core sample? The top 10 files? Just the index? Trying to isolate the index now, Ben muttered, his focus absolute, his face inches from the screen. His screen was a blur of scrolling text, a waterfall of incomprehensible data. The file structure is a nightmare, I told you. It's not just encrypted, it's braided. Every file is dependent on the one before and after it. To get one link, you need the whole goddamn chain. This had the fingerprints of Colonel Barakat all over it. The head of Syrian electronic security was a man whose paranoia was matched only by his genius. The briefing back in the sterile, windowless room in Vauxhall Cross had made that clear. Control, a man whose real name Alec had never known and never asked, had slid the blueprints across the polished mahogany table. He was a creature of frayed tweed and quiet disappointment, his face a permanent mask of weary resignation, as if the entire world's failings rested squarely on his stooped shoulders. He smelled faintly of old books, Earl Grey tea, and the Turkish cigarettes he chain-smoked in defiance of every building regulation. The blue-gray smoke curling around his head like a spectral halo. The target is the Syrian embassy, Geneva, Control had said, his voice as dry as autumn leaves. Specifically, the sub-level communications hub. We believe Colonel Barakat has consolidated all active field intelligence onto a single, air-gapped server system. He calls it the archive. We're calling it the Damascus list. He'd tapped a long, nicotine-stained finger on the schematic. The building is a fortress. Standard diplomatic security, supplemented by their own Mukhabarat thugs who answer to no one. A frontal assault is impossible. A remote hack has been tried by every agency with a keyboard, from Langley to the Lubyanka, and all have failed. The server is completely isolated from any external network. Your entry point is unconventional. The plans showed the Syrian embassy and the building adjacent to it, the embassy of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. They were near-identical limestone monoliths, built in the 70s, a time of brutalist architecture and diplomatic paranoia. A shared subterranean service corridor connected their foundations, a forgotten relic of a shared heating system that had been decommissioned decades ago. That was their way in. A rat run, a ghost passage that didn't appear on any modern city plans. You'll enter through the neighboring building's maintenance access, Control had explained, tracing the route with his finger. And proceed through the service corridor. This will bring you to the foundation wall of the Syrian embassy's sublevel. The plans show a sealed archway, bricked up in the 80s. That's your door. You'll go through it, traverse their boiler room, and access the communications hub here. His finger had rested on a small, square room, marked in red. The vault. Every detail had been meticulously planned. The mission was codenamed Operation Chimera. They'd spent 3 weeks in a training facility in the Brecon Beacons, practicing on a full-scale replica of the sub-level in the pissing Welsh rain. They'd memorized the patrol patterns of the 2 night watchmen, the exact 4.255 gigahertz frequency of the CCTV cameras they'd have to bypass, the precise chemical composition of the vault door's tungsten carbide alloy. Ben had written a suite of custom software to handle the data extraction, a digital ghost designed to mimic the server's own diagnostic signals to avoid tripping internal alarms. It was supposed to be a ghost operation, in and out in under an hour. No trace left behind. But now, a polite chime had sounded, and the magnetic locks had clicked shut with the finality of a coffin lid. They were no longer ghosts. They were trapped rats. 84%, Ben hissed, the tension making his voice crack. Come on, you beautiful bastard, come on. Alec moved to the circular hole they had cut in the door, pressing his ear against the cold, thick steel of the main slab. He could hear nothing beyond the multi-tonal hum of the servers. No footsteps, no shouts. That was also wrong. A security alert, even a silent one, should have prompted some kind of response. The Mukhabarat weren't known for their subtlety or their patience. He expected the crash of boots on tile, the barked orders in guttural Arabic. But there was only a profound, listening silence. Maybe it was a false alarm, Ben said, a hopeful tremor in his voice. A system glitch. The ghost loop could have stuttered. The lock's engaged, Alec reminded him flatly, the words like stones in his mouth. That's not a glitch. That's a response. He felt a cold knot tightening in his stomach. This was a new kind of silence, a professional silence, the kind that precedes a carefully coordinated action. The memory of their flawless entry replayed in his mind's eye, a high-speed film reel he scanned for a single misstep, a single flaw. There was none. The approach through the sleeping, lamp-lit streets of Geneva's diplomatic quarter, the moon hidden behind a thick blanket of Swiss cloud. They'd moved like shadows, their footfalls making no sound on the damp pavement. The descent into the sewer access point a block away had been textbook. The air had been cold and rank, with the smell of stagnant water and decay. The only sound the distant gurgle of unseen effluent and the scuttling of rats just beyond the beam of his light. They'd navigated the labyrinthine tunnels using a digital map on Ben's wrist-mounted Garmin display, until they found the designated junction. Above them, a rusted iron ladder led to a maintenance manhole. Alec had gone up first, using a fiber-optic scope to check the service alley above. It was empty, glistening under a single sodium lamp that cast long, distorted shadows. He'd twisted the heavy cover open with a custom-built wrench, the metal groaning softly in protest. Once inside the Luxembourg embassy's basement, the real work began. The air was dry and dusty, smelling of old paper and forgotten machinery. They moved past decommissioned boilers the size of small cars and stacks of yellowed diplomatic records tied with rotting string. The tight beam of Alec's headlamp cutting a clean path through the decades of darkness. They found the entrance to the shared service corridor exactly where the plan said it would be, hidden behind a stack of rickety metal shelving. The corridor itself was narrow and claustrophobic, the brickwork damp and cold to the touch. It felt like a tomb. After 50 yards of slow, careful progress, they reached the sealed archway. Alec had used a sonic resonator to check for vibrations, confirming the boiler room on the other side was empty. Then he'd set to work with a diamond-tipped core drill, creating a small hole to insert the scope. The view was exactly as rehearsed. Old, grime-covered pipes, a cracked concrete floor, and the heavy steel door to the communications hub. The coast was clear. Removing the bricks was slow, arduous work. Each one had to be carefully cut out with a water-cooled micro saw, the dust and slurry immediately vacuumed up by a muffled hose. It took them 20 minutes of painstaking, sweat-soaked labor to create an opening just large enough to squeeze through. They had slipped into the boiler room, replaced the bricks from the inside using a quick-setting polymer resin that mimicked old mortar, and then approached the communications hub. The lock was a Medico biaxial, a respectable challenge, but for Alec, it was a familiar puzzle. He had it open in under 2 minutes. The delicate art of manipulating pins and tumblers, a form of meditation for him. And then, the vault. A monster, a gleaming slab of brushed steel and tungsten set into a reinforced concrete wall. That's where the thermic lance came in. Brute force, applied with surgical precision. Alec had carved a perfect, shimmering circle around the locking mechanism, the air growing thick and hot. When the circle was complete, he'd used a magnetic winch to pull the 200-pound slab of metal free. They were in. Everything had been perfect. So what in God's name had gone wrong? 91%, Ben whispered, snapping Alec back to the suffocating present. Then Alec heard it. A new sound, not through the air but transmitted up through the concrete floor. A faint, rhythmic thud. It was a sound he knew intimately. The sound of tactical boots on a staircase. Not the clumsy tread of a night watchman, but the synchronized, deliberate placement of feet by a team moving with deadly purpose. And they were getting closer. "Ben, we're out of time," Alec said, his voice low and urgent. "Kill the download. Pack it up. We're going." "No. 10 seconds, Al. Just 10 seconds more. 95%. 97. The rhythmic thudding stopped. They were outside the boiler room. A new sound reached him, a faint metallic scraping against the communications hub door. They weren't picking the lock. They were planting something. "Breaching charge," Alec hissed. "Now, Ben." Ben yanked the cable from the server with a shower of tiny sparks. The screen went black as he slammed the laptop shut and shoved it into its shockproof sleeve. "Done. 99%. I got it. I got the whole damn thing," he said, a note of manic triumph in his voice. The triumph was short-lived. A deafening crack echoed from the outer room, a sharp, explosive report powerful enough to make the massive vault door vibrate. It was followed by the splintering of wood and the shriek and crash of metal. They'd blown the door to the communications hub clean off its hinges. "Get back," Alec yelled, grabbing Ben's collar and pulling him away from the vault entrance. He positioned himself to the side of the circular opening, his pistol held in a two-handed grip, trained on the dark void. They heard shouts now, sharp and guttural, but the language wasn't Arabic. It sounded like German or French. Silence descended again for 3 heart-stopping seconds. Then a small, black, cylindrical object skittered through the opening in the vault door and bounced across the floor. A Nico impulse flashbang. Alec didn't hesitate. He threw himself on top of Ben, driving him to the floor and burying his partner's head and his own against the cold concrete, shutting his eyes tight and opening his mouth to equalize the pressure. The grenade detonated with a blinding, searing flash of white light and a thunderous concussion that seemed to rupture the very air in the small room. His ears screamed with a high-pitched whine, and his vision, even through closed eyelids, was a swimming mess of purple and green phosphenes. Before they could recover, black-clad figures were pouring through the opening. They moved with a fluid, terrifying efficiency, the beams from their weapon-mounted lights cutting through the lingering smoke. Lasers from their SIG 550 assault rifles painted dots of crimson light on Alex's chest. "Hände hoch, auf den Boden!" a voice commanded, sharp and precise. German. "Mains en l'air, au sol," another one shouted. French. Alex's mind, still reeling from the blast, struggled to make sense of it. Swiss police. He slowly raised his hands, the Sig Sauer feeling impossibly heavy. He let it clatter to the floor. Ben did the same beside him, groaning, a thin trickle of blood running from his nose. A heavy boot pressed down on Alex's neck, grinding his face into the cold, hard floor. His hands were yanked behind his back and cinched painfully tight with a plastic zip tie. He was rolled over, and he found himself staring up at a man in a black helmet, his face completely obscured by a ballistic visor. The patch on his arm wasn't the Syrian eagle. It was a stylized tiger's head, rendered in subdued gray and black. Unité d'Intervention Tigris, the elite tactical unit of the Geneva Cantonal Police. They were hauled unceremoniously to their feet, disoriented and utterly defeated. As they were frog-marched out of the vault, through the ruined doorway of the communications hub and into the boiler room, Alex's eyes desperately scanned his surroundings, his training forcing him to gather intelligence even in the midst of a catastrophic failure. He was trying to piece together the disaster. And then he saw it. On the wall of the boiler room, just past the twisted metal frame of the door, was a small, unassuming plaque. It was brass, polished to a high sheen that reflected the beams of the officers' flashlights. Next to it, hanging from a hook, was a framed photograph. It wasn't a picture of Bashar al-Assad or his father. It was a smiling, portly man with a neat mustache and kind eyes. The Grand Duke of Luxembourg. The plaque read, in elegant, engraved French. This heating system was graciously updated through a grant from the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg in the spirit of European cooperation, Anno Domini 1998. Alex's blood ran cold. He looked around the boiler room, his trained eye now seeing what his focused, mission-oriented mind had previously ignored. The pipes were too new, gleaming copper and insulated steel, too well maintained for a Syrian government building. The pressure gauges were modern Siemens digital models, not the old Soviet-era analog junk he'd seen in the intel photos. The faint smell in the air wasn't just dust and neglect. It was industrial floor wax. His gaze flickered back to the archway they had come through. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The service corridor, the shared corridor, the two identical mirrored buildings. He looked at Ben, whose face was a mask of confusion, pain, and dawning horror. Alex's own expression must have mirrored it, because a Swiss officer, seeing his catastrophic realization, offered a dry, unamused smile. "Monsieur," the officer said in heavily accented but perfect English, gesturing around the well-kept boiler room. "Welcome to the embassy of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. I believe you took a wrong turn." The debriefing, if one could grant it such a formal title, took place 3 weeks later. 3 weeks of diplomatic hell, spent in a comfortable but inescapable Swiss detention facility, while men in expensive suits shouted at each other over secure phone lines. The official story, cooked up by the Foreign Office and reluctantly accepted by the Swiss, was that they were high-end corporate thieves who had mistaken the embassy for a neighboring private bank. It was a story so thin it was transparent, but it was the only story that prevented a full-blown international incident. The Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, bless their neutral, chocolate-loving hearts, were more bemused than outraged. Their primary concern was the cost of repairing the vault door, which, it turned out, housed their diplomatic payroll and a rather fine collection of vintage port. The flight back to RAF Northolt on a gray, drizzly morning had been silent. They were met on the tarmac, not by a welcoming party, but by two grim-faced men from the service's Internal Affairs Division, the ones they called the Undertakers. They were escorted to a safe house in the London suburbs, a place with no windows, soundproofed walls, and an oppressive silence that was far worse than the Swiss prison. Now, Alex sat across a plain metal table from control. Ben was not present. They were being debriefed separately, the first and surest sign that the service was looking for a scapegoat. The room was cold, the air scrubbed clean and sterile. Control hadn't offered him tea. A truly dire omen. Operation Chimera was a catastrophic failure. Control began, his voice devoid of any emotion. He didn't look at Alec, instead focusing his gaze on the thick file open in front of him. It resulted in the arrest of two senior field officers, the exposure of a highly sensitive intelligence-gathering operation to a friendly but non-allied nation, and considerable diplomatic embarrassment for His Majesty's government. Alec remained silent. There was nothing to say. He had walked through the mission 100 times in his head, every single step, every breath, every choice. They hadn't made a mistake. The entry was clean. The execution was by the book. But the book had been wrong. The schematics you were given were precise, Control continued, his gaze still fixed on the papers. They were acquired from the Geneva City Planning Archive by a trusted local asset. They were triple verified by our own architectural analysts here in London. The plans were wrong, Alex said, his voice flat and hard. The corridor access point, it led to the wrong foundation wall. The two buildings, their mirror images underground. The Syrian boiler room should have been on the left of the corridor. The plans you gave us showed it on the right. We came up in Luxembourg. Control finally looked up. His eyes were like chips of gray flint. Yes, that is what happened. So the asset was bad, or the analysts missed it. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, a spark of defiance in the cold, dead room. The asset is no longer a concern, Control said cryptically, a phrase that could mean anything from pensioned off to buried in an unmarked grave. And the analysts stand by their work. They claim the plans they received were clear. The digital copies we have on file here in London, the ones they worked from, show the correct layout. The Syrian embassy on the left, Luxembourg on the right. A cold dread, far worse than the one he'd felt in the vault when the chimes sounded, began to creep up Alec's spine. What are you saying? Control steepled his long, thin fingers. We recovered Carter's laptop. The Swiss were surprisingly cooperative, once the right pressures were applied from the right places. They handed it over as a sign of goodwill. Our technicians in Cheltenham decrypted the file he managed to download. Alec leaned forward, a flicker of hope against all odds. The Damascus list? No, Control said. And for the first time, a flicker of something, weary frustration perhaps, crossed his face. Not even close. What Carter downloaded, with seconds to spare before your rather dramatic entrance, was the complete, unencrypted catering manifest for every diplomatic function held by the Luxembourg embassy for the past 5 years. We now know, in excruciating detail, the preferred canapes of the Panamanian trade delegate and the precise brand of mineral water demanded by the Finnish cultural attaché. The absurdity of it was a physical blow. All that risk for a grocery list. Their server wasn't air-gapped. Control continued, his voice a low monotone. It wasn't a fortress of Syrian cybersecurity. It was a standard office network used by the ambassador's secretary to order champagne and vol au vent. Alex slumped back in his chair. The humiliation was a taste like ash and bile in his mouth. So the intel was completely wrong, from top to bottom. Not wrong, Control said softly. And now he closed the file, giving Alec his full, unnerving attention. Sabotaged. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a printout of a digital schematic, the one from the London file. It clearly showed the service corridor and the two adjacent sublevels. The one on the left was marked SYR, the one on the right, LUX. This is the file our analysts worked from, Control said. And this... He slid a second sheet of paper across. It looked identical at first glance. Is a forensic reconstruction of the file as it was loaded onto the tactical tablet you and Carter used for navigation in Geneva. Alec picked it up. He stared at it for a long moment before he saw it. The change was minuscule, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, a masterpiece of subtle corruption. The labels had been swapped. On this version, the blueprint they had staked their lives on, the building on the right was marked SYR. The file was altered. Alec breathed, the cold in the room finally penetrating his bones. Precisely, Control confirmed. Altered after it was authenticated by our analysts, but before it was loaded onto your mission hardware. It was a subtle, brilliant piece of work. The digital checksums were spoofed. The file size was identical to the byte. The only change was the transposition of 3 letters. A single surgical act of sabotage designed to make you fail in the most spectacular and embarrassing way possible. Who? Alec asked, the single word hanging in the dead air. We don't know. But we know how. The file was transferred from our secure internal network to the mission server, which is firewalled from the outside world. The switch must have happened during that transfer, which means the saboteur had access to the highest level of our operational network, a ghost in our own machine. Alec felt the pieces snapping into place with sickening clarity. The remote ping that triggered the alarm. It wasn't the Syrians. It was the saboteur, monitoring their progress, waiting for them to be sealed inside the vault. They had tripped the alarm themselves, anonymously calling in a break-in at the Luxembourg embassy to the Geneva police. They hadn't just sent them to the wrong address. They had gift-wrapped them for the authorities. The goal wasn't just to make them fail. It was to get them caught. They wanted to burn us, Alex said, his voice a low growl, to humiliate the service. And to send a message, Control added, his voice regaining its usual weary tone. To demonstrate the reach they have, that they can reach into the heart of our most sensitive operations and turn them into a farce. He leaned back, the mask of disappointment settling back over his features. The Damascus list was the bait. For us. But your failed mission, Thorne, was the bait for something much bigger. By failing so publicly, you have inadvertently confirmed our worst fears. We have a traitor, not some low-level clerk selling secrets for cash, but a master puppeteer, someone with the access and the skill to manipulate our entire operational architecture. Someone we've been hunting for years, a shadow we only knew by the code name Magpie. The room was silent for a long time. The catastrophic failure, the weeks of imprisonment, the public shame. It had all been a stage play, and he and Ben had been the lead clowns. But the play had served a purpose. It had flushed the ghost out of the shadows just for a second, long enough to leave a trace. "So what happens now?" Alec asked, his voice hoarse. Control stood up, gathering the papers from the table. The debriefing was over. Carter's technical skills are being reassigned to the Cyber Forensics Division at Cheltenham. He'll be hunting Magpie through a microscope. He is, for all intents and purposes, chained to a desk for the foreseeable future. And me? Control walked to the door, his hand resting on the handle. He turned, his gaze unreadable, ancient. You, Thorne, have the unique distinction of being the first MI6 officer to be captured inside the sovereign territory of Luxembourg. You are an embarrassment, a liability. Officially, you're on indefinite administrative leave. He paused, his eyes holding Alec's. Unofficially, you made Magpie show his hand. He thinks he's won. He thinks you're a broken tool, cast aside. A resentful, disgraced agent is of no threat to him. And a man with nothing to lose can be a very useful instrument. He opened the door. The two undertakers were waiting outside, their faces impassive. "Go home, Thorne," Control said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a conspiratorial breath in the sterile hallway. "Wait for the call. The hunt is just beginning." As Alec was escorted out into the gray London drizzle, the smell of burnt metal and ozone still clinging to him like a shroud, he finally understood. Operation Chimera hadn't been about the Damascus list at all. Its true objective had just been revealed. He had been a pawn, sacrificed in the opening move of a much deadlier game. And his war had just started.